As you may know, members of the Canadian Union of Postal Workers are currently on strike and have been for almost the last 2 weeks. In this video, I'm going to be doing a reading, and I want to talk a little bit about what it means for the workers of Canada Post to be on strike and what the bosses and the federal government are up to. I'm going to be reading first from an article that appeared in the Maple at the end of September. Following an announcement from the federal government on September 25th, instructing Canada Post to begin shuttering rural post offices and axing what's left of door-to-door mail delivery, the Canadian Union of Postal Workers, CUPW, launched a nationwide job action. The union seems to have had no idea that these announcements were coming. On September 24th, CUPW claimed they learned through a media advisory that Joel Lightbound, the Minister of Government Transformation, Public Works and Procurement, would hold a press conference about the future of Canada Post the following day. Now, it's worth pointing out that we currently don't have a Minister of Labour. We have a Minister of Government Transformation, whatever that means, and we have a Minister of Jobs and Families, again, whatever that means, but we don't actually have a Labour Minister. At that point, it had been more than a month since the union tabled new offers to Canada Post. I'm quoting the CUPW National President Jan Simpson here, speaking the day before the minister's announcement. Canada Post prefers to talk with anybody but the union. We are left wondering how Canada Post can claim to want to resolve our labor dispute when it refuses to communicate its intentions directly with us, or at least through the federal mediators. The September 25th press conference revealed the mystery behind management's silence. In a move sure to satisfy Canada Post, Lightbound announced that the government will be implementing the recommendations outlined in the Kaplan Report, including ending mail delivery to 4 million homes, lifting the moratorium on rural post office closures, flexibilizing delivery standards by ending the requirement for daily delivery, and making it easier to raise stamp prices more quickly. Recall that the above report was the outcome of an industrial inquiry commission forced on the parties when the previous Liberal government ended CUPW's strike last December. The commission did nothing to advance negotiations while wasting much time and significant resources. Think of the money that's been wasted. Commission Chair William Kaplan dismissed out of hand the union's detailed plans to improve Canada Post's financial position. It's pretty clear that the management doesn't want solutions. The Industrial Inquiry Commission findings, it seems, were a foregone conclusion. The report, however, did provide further ammunition to the Crown Corporation in its attacks on the union. That the government has now adopted the Kaplan Report recommendations further strengthens management's position. Tellingly, there were no consultations with CUPW leadership or workers before the decision announced on September 5th was made. As the union said in its press release explaining the resumption of strike activity, Lightbound gave no indication that the changes were coming when he met with union leaders the week prior. So he definitely is about government transformation here, transforming the government into a less accountable corporate stooge by the sound of it. No one should be shocked, the Maple article goes on, by the CUPW's recent strike, or latest strike. Postal workers have been in a legal strike position since May, when the government-imposed back-to-work legislation order expired. Their union first initiated a ban on overtime work to apply pressure on management without committing the union to a countrywide strike. When this failed to move Canada Post to negotiations, CUPW then announced its members would stop delivering flyers on September 15th. Throughout this period, negotiations have remained stalled as both parties waited to see what the government's next move would be. After Minister of Jobs and Families Aly HB failed to foist a collective agreement on CUPW members through a forced ratification vote in July, Canada Post management was seemingly content to wait for further government assistance. A free market, huh? In an unhelpful, though unfortunately lawful, end run around the union, the Liberals granted Canada Post's request to put a final offer directly to members in May. To no one's surprise, nearly 70% of voting postal workers rejected the proposed contracts. With the government again putting its thumb on the scale for Canada Post management, the union had little choice but to escalate to full job action now. For nearly 2 years, Canada Post management has been pushing a narrative that the Crown Corporation is broke, and the only solution is to impose the costs of restructuring on workers. The union's various proposals to diversify Canada Post and open new revenue streams, whether through postal banking or senior support services, have either been ignored or dismissed. And we have to ask why. Why would management dismiss solid proposals about opening up new revenue streams? Well, maybe because management is preparing to privatize. After receiving new contract proposals more than a month ago, management largely ignored the union, waiting for yet another assist from the government. Management got what it wanted. The Liberals have now co-signed the project of dismantling Canada Post, in the process undermining any possibility of any near-term settlement at the bargaining table. Making their announcement as they did during ongoing negotiations was yet another direct attack on workers, as well as the collective bargaining process in general. Now, I think we shouldn't be under any illusions here. It very much appears that the Liberal government under Mark Carney and the management of Canada Post is preparing to privatize Canada Post. And I think we should be very concerned about that. Canada Post and the Canadian Union of Postal Workers are engaged in a class war. And I think that we should see that that class war is going to affect every single Canadian. So in this video, I'm going to read from Nora Loreto's Corporate Control. You've seen me read this book before if you've watched this channel, but there's a very, very important chapter in this book about privatizing crown corporations and what the consequences have been in terms of privatizing crown corporations. So we are prepared to defend the workers at Canada Post, defend by any means necessary those people who are standing up to the corporate elites, to the banker prime minister, and to the capitalist vultures who are circling crown corporations such as Canada Post. Join me. Just as fast as war-related crown corporations were built, the government went about dismantling many of them as early as 1944. Politicians knew that transitioning back to a liberal peacetime economy had to be done intentionally and would mean both dismantling and privatizing many of the corporations developed for the war period. The administrative crowns were mostly dismantled. There was no longer a need to coordinate the industries to act in unison to support Canada's war efforts, and shortages that had plagued these industries were easing. Politicians also returned many of the corporations created through expropriations to their original owners. And the government created a new crown corporation that oversaw liquidating the surplus supplies generated by these industries. Called the War Assets Corporation, it managed to recover some $450 million in revenues, or $7.3 billion in 2024 dollars, by selling off surplus Crown Corporation goods. At the same time, the influx of veterans into an already tight housing market threatened to force housing costs sky high. The federal government merged Wartime Housing Limited and the National Housing Administration, bodies housed within the Department of Finance, into a new Crown Corporation, the Central Mortgage and Housing Corporation. Some of these Crown corporations still operate today. The Central Mortgage and Housing Corporation is now the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, or CMHC. They backstop mortgages by providing mortgage insurance to buyers who cannot put 20% or more into a down payment. Research Enterprises, the manufacturing wing of the NRC, was sold for parts by C.D. Howe. 80% of Research Enterprises' business was related to radar and communications equipment. Although Howe invested heavily in the airline industry, including setting up and then privatizing 2 more companies, he did not think there was a post-war future for a plant that built optical lenses and radar. In 1945, the federal government privatized the Toronto-based facility. The United Auto Workers protested, and both the Conservatives and the CCF opposed the decision. Alistair Stewart, CCF MP for Winnipeg North, argued that the company could easily be expanded to manufacture anything from hearing aids to radio components. And indeed, he imagined that someday radar would be used to land planes, quote, with all the precision we associate with the movement of railway trains today, unquote. Howe remained unconvinced of any use for peacetime radar instruments. The government sold one building to the Corning Glass, where they manufactured Pyrex dishes for decades, for a fifth of what they had paid for it. But there was another business person who was glad to take research enterprises off the hands of the government. His company was called Rogers Majestic Limited. It had done business with research enterprises during the war and manufactured radio equipment. Its owner was someone whose family you likely still pay money to, Edward Ted Rogers Sr. In the sale, Rogers bought 13 buildings and was guaranteed $1.7 million, or $25 million in 2004 dollars, in sales to the Canadian Army. Ted Rogers Jr. moved the company towards broadcasting and television and sold all Research Enterprises factories to the electronics company Philips. And well, you know what happened to Rogers Communication Enterprise. Borens laments the breakup of Research Enterprises, as the company had the potential to create innovative new technologies thanks to its close relationship to the NRC. If creating a new elite class was partly behind the Nazis' desire to privatize crowns, privatizing Canadian crowns also came with the same result. CMHC isn't the only crown corporation that still operates today. The War Assets Corporation turned into the Crown Assets Disposal Corporation, which is now GCS Surplus, operated directly by the Department of Public Procurement and Services Canada. You can buy anything from offloaded military equipment to RCMP horses to a kinematic AG 3100D homogenizer with accessories. I'm not sure what that is. From the 1950s to the 1970s, crown corporations were created by the same kind of logic that guided the government during the Second World War. Basically, crown corporations if necessary, but not necessarily crown corporations. But by the 1980s, attitudes had shifted significantly, and there was a full-scale ideological war against them. Brian Mulroney, backed by the BCNI, started to dismantle many of Canada's most important crown corporations. And like the sale of Research Enterprises, many of these sales deeply enriched private corporations. Bank of Canada researchers Mylene Levac and Philip Woodridge tabulated the worth of the 30 most significant privatizations from 1985 to 2011, which occurred under the governments of Brian Mulroney, Jean Chrétien, and Stephen Harper. These include selling de Havilland aircraft to Boeing for $99 million, munitions manufacturer Canadian Arsenals Limited to SNC-Lavalin Group for $90 million, a zinc-lead mining operation called Nanisivik Mines to Mineral Resources International Limited for $6 million, Canadair to Bombardier for $143 million, and CN Hotels to CPR for $265 million. Air Canada sold in 2 public offerings for $708 million. Petro-Canada sold in 4 public offerings for $5.6 billion. Canada sold 51% of its shares in the uranium mining company Cameco in 5 public offerings for $440 million. Telsat Canada sold to Alouette Communications Inc. for $155 million. A CN short line in Nova Scotia sold to Railtex Inc. for $20 million. CN sold in a public offering for $2 billion. The Canada Communications Group, which was a printing, warehousing, and distribution company, sold to St. Joseph Corporation, St. Joseph's Communications, for $6 million. And the Atomic Energy of Canada's commercial division sold for $15 million to SNC-Lavalin for $15 million. In total, the money Canada made off these sales was just under $12 billion. When Canada privatized CN, it was the biggest offering of public shares of a government entity in Canada's history. Most crowns were sold to corporations, not in public offerings on the stock market. Levac and Woodridge estimate that in the case of CN, the largest and most complex privatization, the outcome didn't significantly impact the wages or employment of the workers or the cost of services. And there was the added bonus that the Canadian government could now collect taxes from the private businesses. Anthony Boardman and Aidan Vinning calculate that CN pays average taxes of $600 million per year as a private corporation, though Air Canada, which is notably less profitable than CN, pays, quote, virtually no tax at all, unquote. What is less obvious is the political impact of these corporations now being in the hands of private decision makers, whose interests and priorities are not necessarily the same as they would be if the corporations were still public. There is a fundamental difference in perception of transportation, shipping, and logistics when a company is owned by the government versus when the company is owned by shareholders. CN is a perfect example. In 2023, CN made $16.8 billion in profit. They move freight, everything from grain to liquefied natural gas, potash, and refined petroleum products. Despite the company paying $863 million in taxes in 2023, it's hard to argue that the profit couldn't be better used to make improvements to operations or salaries, for example, or imagine that some of it could go back into general revenues for Canada. Or, considering how much oil and gas companies rely on it, CN could be a fundamental part of Canada's climate sustainability policies. Hell, if we were getting really creative, we could easily fund a portion of CBC Radio-Canada off some of CN's profits, especially considering how the one organization grew out of the other. CN's profits are more than 7 times higher than the total operating budget of CBC Radio-Canada. But instead, CN's largest shareholders are Bill and Melinda Gates, who also happen to be, as of 2021 at least, the largest private owners of land in the United States. If it makes sense for two of the world's richest people to be in the business of agriculture and transportation, why doesn't it make sense for the government of Canada to be in it too? Private ownership also creates a negative feedback loop that creates self-enforcing logic. For example, when dock workers went on strike in British Columbia in 2023, it put pressure on all the corporations who use the ports to move their goods. This strike posed a threat to CN's profits, and CN therefore became a de facto lobbyist for the government to intervene in the strike. According to Christopher Reynolds at the Canadian Press, CN announced as part of its October 2023 investor call that they made a profit of $16.8 billion, and yet the workers had to strike to fight for some of the corporation's sky-high profits. Or consider the political opposition to expanding high-speed passenger rail along the Windsor-Quebec City corridor. With so many flights between Toronto, Ottawa, and Montreal, expanding high-speed passenger rail poses a threat to Air Canada, Porter Airlines, and WestJet. If Canada still owned both Air Canada and the rail line, the country could develop an integrated transportation network that would use air when the distances were far and rail to get people from Montreal to Toronto in just 2 hours. Instead, the conversation has pivoted to high-frequency trains. Trains that are not much faster but travel more often. Something that won't really threaten Air Canada's market capture, considering that a 9-hour trip from Quebec City to Toronto without a sleeper car will never compete with 1 hour in the air, 1 hour 20 gate to gate. Not to mention that Canada doesn't actually own the rail that Via Rail trains run along. Bet you didn't know that. Levac and Woodridge argue that crown corporations have been used to facilitate public policies for a long time. Quote, federal crown corporations such as Canadian Arsenals, Air Canada, and Petro-Canada facilitated government policy in the areas of national security, cross-Canada transportation, and Canadian ownership in the domestic oil industry, respectively. Corporations that allowed politicians into aspects of the economy created a channel through which to carry out public policy that otherwise does not exist. And that touches on the key problem with privatizing crown corporations. Some of Canada's most important industries are now dominated by corporations that started as crowns, were built to serve all Canadians, and now have way too much power over our economy, the communities in which they operate, and the workers they employ. Consider that, as of 2016, Bombardier absorbed 2 Canadian airline companies. SNC-Lavalin got a munitions company. and the commercial division of Atomic Energy Canada and BCE, aka Bell, got Telsat Canada and 2 telecommunications companies. Some were sold off to foreign companies. What is left of Polymer Corporation is now owned by German companies. As for provincial crowns, Prince Albert Pulp Inc. was absorbed by Weyerhaeuser. Donahue Inc. is controlled by Abitibi Bowater. Canadian Natural Resources controls a former Alberta oil and gas crown called SOQUIP Alberta. Syncrude is operated by 7 companies, and Ontario Power Generation's 4 hydroelectric stations are part of Brookfield Asset Management. And the web of corporate Canada spins thicker, more concentrated, more opaque, and further away from anything resembling democratic control. Now, of course, with the rise of the banker Prime Minister Mark Carney, we're now seeing the web of corporate Canada spin thicker and thicker and thicker. While it seems that many people have chosen to trust Mark Carney and his elbows up rhetoric, what we're seeing with what's happening to Canada Post workers is a clear threat and a clear indication that what Mark Carney and the Liberals want to do is privatize Canada Post. And I hope you can agree with me that that would be a terrible idea and we need to fight against it. So that's why I support the Canada Post workers. That's why I support Cup W in their strike, and I hope you do too. If you like this video, please click like, and we'll see you in another video. Ciao for now. Solidarity forever. Cup W, you guys go. Fuck the management.